Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just so everyone knows, we are recording this event, so if you want to watch it later on, it'll be on the Greenlight Bookstore YouTube. So, good evening and welcome. We're excited to host tonight's event with Michael Snyder presenting his new book, James Purdy, Life of a Contrarian Writer. He will be talking with Maria Cecilia Holt and Loy von Kessel, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, please make sure to silence your cell phones, keep your masks on during the duration of the event, and if you are interested in buying a copy of Michael's book afterwards, it is signed and at the register for you. Our first guest for this evening is Maria Cecilia Holt. Maria holds a doctorate in theology from Harvard University. She has been active in the preservation and promotion of the work of James Purdy, Anne Blonstein, and Charmaine London. From 2015 to 2019, she assisted James Purdy's literary executor, John Euchre, in the fulfillment of Purdy's desire to have his ashes buried by the grave of Dame Edith Sitwell. Our second guest this evening is Loy von Kessel. Loy is an assistant professor in literary theory and gender studies at Leiden University, and editor-in-chief for the Dutch Journal of Gender Studies. He wrote his PhD dissertation on melodrama and sexual identity in the novels and plays of James Purdy. He has published on topics ranging from promiscuity and queer literature to RuPaul's Drag Race. They will be speaking with our featured author, Michael Snyder. Michael is the author of John Joseph Matthews' Life of an Osage Writer, which was a finalist for the Oklahoma Book Award in Nonfiction, and Our Osage Hills, toward an Osage ecology and triballography of the 20th century. An expert on gay literature and Native writers, Snyder is an assistant teaching professor at Dodge Family College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oklahoma. Tonight we're all here for a celebration of the life and work of James Purdy, so you're in for something special. Michael will be reading from the book, and then Maria and Loy will join him in conversation, and you'll have a chance to ask your questions after that. So please join me in welcoming everyone to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
A little louder.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to read just a few brief excerpts from the biography, and carefully selected. Hope you enjoy it. Let's see. Okay, the first thing I'm going to read relates to the novel I Am Elijah Thrush. And the novel I Am Elijah Thrush has just been reissued, and they actually have it up at the front counter. So it was reissued on the same day as the biography somehow. So that and Out with the Stars, right? So those are two New York novels, in fact, out of the Purdy works. So this one is about Paul Swan, who was an inspiration for Elijah Thrush. On Sunday, October 27th, Purdy and Jorma Sjöblom, who was his partner, took in a fascinating performance at a studio at Carnegie Hall by Paul Swan, a dancer, actor, portraitist, and sculptor, then 73 years old. A worshiper of ancient Greek culture and gods, Swan was known for his decades of dance and dramatic performances. With long hair and fingernails, bisexual Swan wore thick stage makeup on and off stage. Raised in Illinois and Nebraska, he found fame in the early 20th century. During Paul Swan's Sunday shows, sophisticated Forrest Fraser, his handsome young secretary, opened the door for a small group composed mostly of elderly followers. Quote, "Paul Swan, it is whispered, is really a man of 80, although he appears to be quite young. Only very old people were in the audience of this small concert hall. A gong was struck and one smelled strong incense. Quote, the lights were extinguished, and when they came on, A nearly naked man came dancing over the small stage. At the end, Swan, dressed in an Asian cap and adorned with many jewels, gave a lecture on individualism and the Greeks. Underneath Swan's, quote, strange and often outlandish behavior, one sensed a genuine man, and if he is 80, his dancing is remarkable for its vigor, if nothing else. Coleman Dowell, who was a writer and kind of a rival to Purdy, was less charitable. He recalled evenings with Carl van Vechten, quote, refraining from laughter at Swan's recitals, where dancer and audience practice an extreme form of masochism. This event led to an unusual relationship between Paul Swan and James Purdy that was the genesis of Purdy's novel I'm Elijah Thrush, which was not published until 1972. Paul Swan wrote 2 days later with lavish praise of Purdy's 2 privately published books, which James possibly gave him at the recital. Quote, I have spent all day immersed in the artistry of your stories, so varied in mood and character, so smooth in the unfolding and so original in theme and observation. They all bore the same high imprint of a supreme artist, unquote. The mail was not fast enough for Swan since he phoned actor Sandy Campbell, the partner of novelist Donald Wyndham, requesting Purdy's phone number, having, quote, spent the day apparently in ecstasy, reading his books, and wanted to tell James how much he liked them. 2 days later, he told Purdy, I hope you will be present to stimulate my muse Sunday. I've needed an incentive for more than 2 years, but a mentality as rich and fertile as yours will serve to bring out the utmost of my capabilities. We both are destined to be in solitude except upon rare occasions. I do not think our separate talents will neutralize each other. Do you? Over the next 5 years, Paul Swan sent James and Jorma several free tickets, and half a dozen times they attended his recitals at his studio at Carnegie Hall, which were out of this world, Jorma recalled. He also sent invitations to dinner. Paul Swan was, quote, an important element in our Manhattan life. That was Jorma showed them. So that was, I mean, just to note that, that was 1957. And then, so James Purdy lived at 236 Henry Street in Brooklyn Heights for like almost 50 years, about 50 years, and wrote most of his books, 50 plus. This is about when he moved to Brooklyn Heights. Beginning in late 1958, James and Jorma lived at a new address, 236 Henry Street, apartment 8 in Brooklyn Heights. They had viewed the west side apartment where they had lived as temporary. Noting Purdy's, quote, indecision at ever settling down, a young man in publishing insisted that he view an available room in an old mansion. Brooklyn Heights in this period was considered and this is a quote from, I think, Dan Wakefield, a suburb of Greenwich Village, a quiet bedroom community where writers lived in reasonably priced apartments near a pleasant walkway with view of the water. W.E.B. Du Bois had a place nearby, and Jorma and James glimpsed him standing by the window, which I got to see recently. It's a very large window. You can kind of imagine him standing there, and it was kind of a figure from another era. They lived near the promenade or esplanade, which offered excellent views of lower Manhattan and New York Harbor and had a gay reputation. Around the corner on Montague Street was Lassen and Hennig's, Purdy's favorite delicatessen, where he would order whitefish and pike or a turkey sandwich. Also on Montague was Sam Colton's bookstore that he ran with his wife Sylvia, where James was a regular customer and later inscribed books to them and gave them tickets to an adaptation of his work. John Strassbaugh writes that on approaching Purdy's building, from 2 blocks away he knew he had spotted the place. A brooding, quote, behemoth of a red brick Victorian mansion, complete with mansard roof and gables and even guttering gaslights out front. It could be home to many of his characters, the big old house unmoored in time, where they fret and pace and go mad and shoot their lovers and then hang themselves from the rafters in the attic, unquote. Rumor had it the house was haunted. The mansion, he was told, was built by a sea captain around 1875, and as late as the early 50s, quote, old-time residents recalled seeing the surviving sisters of the captain now extremely venerable, taking their supper by candlelight, attended by elegantly attired black servants, Purdy later wrote. After the sisters died, the house was sold and divided into at least 11 whittled-down units, thus destroying some of the essential grandeur of the house, but allowing the beautiful hand-carved staircase to remain mostly unscathed. His favorite feature was big windows facing south and east. Pausing from writing, he could look out on an endless procession of human beings of every ethnic origin imaginable, see the southern sky with its panorama of clouds, and look down on the shrubs of holly, spirea, honeysuckle, and rose of Sharon. Brooklyn Heights possessed a rich, gay literary legacy. Walt Whitman, the American poet most precious to Purdy, who celebrated adhesive love among men, had lived in the neighborhood and hand-set the first edition of Leaves of Grass there. Purdy lived down the street from the storied St. George Hotel at Henry and Clark Streets, a, quote, notorious gay rendezvous point up through the 1960s, unquote, and below the hotel was the Clark Street subway station with a, quote, cruisy reputation. And those are from Hugh Ryan, who had a book called When Brooklyn Was Queer. A native of northern Ohio, like James Purdy, poet Hart Crane, the muse of Tennessee Williams and other gay writers, lived at the St. George for short periods in the 1920s. In Crane's cosmology, queer love, Whitman, and Brooklyn were tightly interwoven as they became for many others. In Brooklyn Heights, the inveterate cruiser Hart Crane had several places from which he could choose to cruise. For future generations of LGBTQ people, Brooklyn Heights, quote, now held a special luster. In the early 1940s, February House on 7 Midda Street was an artist and writer commune that attracted LGBTQ people, writers, poets, and composers, including Carson McCullers, W.H. Auden, Paul and Jane Bowles, Aaron Copland, and Virgil Thompson. And some of those were friends and fans of Purdy, like Virgil Thompson. I'm sure that'll come up later. So, and then one last little bitty here. I wanted to read something else about New York. This is in the midst of the 80s, I guess, or the early 80s. Some comments that he made. One anecdote speaks volumes about how Purdy lived his life rarely satisfied. In 1983, producer Douglas Blair Turnbaugh presented a dramatized reading of Purdy works off-Broadway at the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater with a, quote, distinguished cast of equity actors, including the veteran black actress Jane White. Purdy was dissatisfied with the male casting, however. Whom do you want? Turnbaugh asked. James Dean and Marlon Brando. James did find some satisfaction in New York City life, notwithstanding its problems. The city was, quote, decaying in many ways, its subways dangerous and filthy. Quote, I have to ride on them all the time, but every time I get on them, I think maybe it's my last ride. Quote, despite New York's drawbacks, its pandemonium of crime, madness, filth, and noise, all finding their apotheosis in the hot seats from hell, the subways, I have found it the place where I can write undisturbed and where I can communicate freely with other souls, he wrote in 1984. Edmund White wrote in States of Desire from 1980 that in New York, a gay man must be smart and successful, but success, quote, need not be monetary, unquote. Bookworms from the Midwest found it a curious reversal. Quote, in the city, knowledge, or at least a reputation for having it, can carry a distinct social cachet. To say he's very smart is a less ambiguous compliment in New York than in gay culture at large. Wisdom, of course, is less prized than savvy, but even so, New York's love of culture renders it more suitable for older gays than most other places. The man of 60 who publishes books will never be without his coterie in New York. Unquote, goes Edmund White, last quotation. And then a little bit here about Gordon Lish. In an unusual role reversal in November, Gordon Lish sent Purdy his first novel, Dear Mr. Capote. The narrator, claiming to be a serial killer in search of a chronicler, addresses the immortalizer of the murderers of a rural Franzen family, somewhat recalling the scenario of Cabot Wright Begins. Purdy loved it, since he could hear Lish's, quote, voice so clearly in it. James mailed Lish some of his books to give to, quote, kindred souls that might pass your way, and sent Valentine's Day cards to him during the 1980s. Purdy would mail vintage Easter, Valentine's, birthday, and Christmas cards to special friends during this period. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Greenlight Bookstore for hosting tonight's event, and to all of you for attending. This is a night of celebration for Purdy readers and scholars all around the world, and I'm sure they would join me in expressing a debt of gratitude to Michael for writing James Purdy's biography at last. At last. Now, renowned editor and fiction writer Gordon Lish, of whom Michael was just speaking, has called the biography a work of art and a real credit to Jim, Gordon Lish has said, and that is high praise indeed. And Bill Troop, a friend of James Purdy's, who has also served as an editor on 2 of James Purdy's last works, has lauded Michael's gift of storytelling and gossiping, Bill has told me, and that James would have adored this book, and would have likely encouraged Michael to write more. I was fascinated by the biography, not least because the town historian or memorist plays such a significant role in James Purdy's novels, along with the funeral director and the swanky scholar. And as has already been mentioned in my own biography, of the 3 of us up here, I'm the funeral director. I helped to bury James Purdy's ashes beside Dame Edith Sitwell's grave in England, and it wasn't an easy task, even on behalf of a writer notorious for digging his own grave. In an interview with Fred Barron, featured in Penthouse magazine in 1974, James has said, "When I write a book, my publishers publish it in the dead of night. They go out in a deserted garden and dig an 80-foot pit and put it in. And then they go out and forget about it." As a person who carried James Purdy's ashes from New York to Copenhagen in 2015 and arranged for their burial beside Dame Edith Sitwell's grave in Northamptonshire, England, an arduous task that I shared with Purdy's late literary executor John Euchre, Bill Troop, and Charles Locke, who co-edited James Purdy's correspondence with British writer John Cooper Powys, another of Purdy's early champions. One question I often pondered during our 3 years of planning the burial was how and why an authentic American genius would wish to be buried in exile. Now, John Euchre also wondered the same thing, and this was, he did say, well, he wanted to be buried beside his British patron saint. And then then I remembered what John Euchre told me as I had passed the ashes through security at Boston Logan. And John Euchre told me, America doesn't deserve James. In this respect, Michael could not have chosen a better title for his biography Life of a Contrarian Writer. It's all the more painful when one reads that James apparently said on Dutch television in 1990, you see, people say, I hate the United States, but I am the United States. I am the United States. That's what James Purdy said. Fred Barron had called James Purdy the chronicler of the American soul. What is the American soul? James Purdy had also said, well, memory is the soul. It is the psyche. There's really only one soul. There's really the soul for the writer. And America, James said, the America we have now wants to destroy the body and soul both. That's on page 253 of the biography. For a writer hailed for being purely American, that's by Tom Gunn, and as the master of the American vernacular, that's Marion Moore, why is Purdy so little recognized these days? Well, in 1978, in Notes on Recognition, James had this to say, and we have Michael again to thank for digging this up. James said, we are waiting for someone to recognize us, but they won't. It's too difficult, or too painful, or too embarrassing, so they turn away. They say all the polite, expected things. They say all the flippant, cruel things. All the words we speak because we are not recognized, and because we are avoiding recognizing someone else. Who is that someone else we avoid recognizing? Is it a grief-stricken mother in eventide, Mahala waiting for her beloved son T-Boy to come home, and her sister who is visited by the ghost of her dead son, baby George Watson, who died from sleeping sickness? We see this undercurrent of sleep, desire, and death throughout James's stories. There's the soldier who can only admit to his love while sleepwalking in Eustace Chisholm and the Works. That same soldier disemboweled for his desire. There's another war veteran disfigured beyond recognition in a shallow grave. And many more dead or missing. The paraplegic who cannot stand the sound of birds. An artist enamored with the bird of heaven in I Am Elijah Thrush. A woman who refuses to take her husband's name in Don't Call Me by My Right Name. Another woman who endures an illegal abortion. That is in Eustace Chisholm and the Works. A boy with black cords coming out of his mouth. A boy whose mouth keeps a wedding ring. That's A Color of Darkness. 4 boys in an Appalachian town who love one another to death. Narrow Rooms. In many of the reviews of these stories and novels, as Michael tells us, Purdy is distinguished for American speech, even if the topic makes readers or reviewers squirm. Now, who wants to read about the middle of nowhere? Who expects there to be anything magical or literary from such a place? In the epilogue to Mourners Below, we find some clues. Mr. Bledsoe asks the billiard hall owner why his dead son Justin should have been entrusted with a precious packet. Holby's response is characteristic of Purdy's outsiderhood. The marginalized, misunderstood American other, and the writer who is their chronicler. If we substitute Justin for James, this becomes even more clear. Holby says, I wouldn't know how to put it into words without making myself sound like an ass. I know you think I'm worse than that. But if we substitute Justin for James, James didn't think so. James thought highly of me, and he gave me the thing that he said was closest to him, the letters. In his writing, James gave words to these worlds, otherwise unrecognized by the so-called literary establishment. When asked by Virgil Thomson, "Where did you get this lingo?" James answered, "I hear it." Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for having me. So I'll use the microphone. So what is a Dutch scholar doing in the United States to talk about the American author James Purdy? Well, I'm about to tell you. And we've already heard about this particular interview that James Purdy did on Dutch television. And this is actually the only television interview that James Purdy conducted in his lifetime. And there is a special connection between James Purdy and the Netherlands. So in this brief passage, or in this brief talk, I wanted to highlight some aspects of that special connection. And I wanted to do so by referring briefly to a passage in Michael's biography, a passage where he, in just one paragraph, talks about this momentous journey of Purdy in going to the Netherlands. This was in March 1990, and I cite from the biography. Purdy flew to the Netherlands to promote collected poems, which synchronized with the Dutch translation of Garments the Living Wear, both published by Atheneum Palakke and Van Gennep. He visited Jan-Erik Bouwman, a co-dedicatee of Garments. Jan-Erik introduced him to a publisher that was very fond of his writing and had published his poems in English in small bibliophile editions. And Purdy's book signing events at bookstores attracted crowds. In Amsterdam, readers queued into the streets, and it took 4 hours to sign all the books. That is the longest book signing event James Purdy has had in his life. For Dutch Purdy enthusiasts like me, this visit to the Netherlands is quite legendary. Purdy had already acquired a small and devoted group of friends and admirers in the country leading up to his visit. The visit, however, really established Purdy as one of the most important American authors of his age, at least in Dutch eyes. The Dutch edition of Garments the Living Wear even became Purdy's bestseller in the Netherlands, while, on the other hand, American audiences responded lukewarm at best, like they did with most of his novels of this period. Purdy's special relationship to the Netherlands, or perhaps the Dutch special admiration of Purdy, started with the first translation of Color of Darkness, which was published in 1974 in the Netherlands. The translation was by the young Dutch poet Hans Plomp. Now, Hans Plomp, out of the blue, had sent and had dedicated his first volume of poems to James Purdy and sent this to Purdy. And in a very Purdian kind of move, he then wormed his way in a correspondence with him that lasted a couple of years and that led up to Hans Plomp translating Heart of Darkness. Now, what is interesting if you read the correspondence between James Purdy and Hans Plomp is that in that brief correspondence you see Purdy's tendency to have a very volatile relationship with friendship, as Michael quite well describes in the biography. So he could turn on a person at a whim if he felt even in the slightest bit misrecognized or mistreated. But just the same, he could really quickly fall in love with a person. So in letters written to Plomp in 1968, 1969, Purdy is full of admiration. But suddenly that changes, and this is when Plomp for the first time starts talking about translating Heart of Darkness, Color of Darkness, if only. And Hans Blom talks about how difficult for him it is to translate Purdy's short stories into Dutch. And Purdy doesn't take Blom's criticism almost kindly, and he writes a very spiteful letter that I won't only partially cite here. Purdy writes to Hans, "Poor little Hans. You complain about my work like the Philistine New York critics. Why is it so depressing? Where did you find such awful people? Why do you write like this? Maybe the Hottentots will capture you in Africa and roast some sense into you. I was going to say your trouble is that you are too young to understand my work, but that's not true. Anyhow, nobody asked you to translate my work, and nobody asked you to now, or to write me, or anything." This is quite a sharply written letter, right? And this is also the last letter Purdy writes to Hans Blom, until 3 years later, when eventually the Dutch translation of Color of Darkness was published, and Purdy has a change of heart, quite sudden. Because in 1974 he writes, "Dear Hans, I like the Dutch translation and the edition of Color of Darkness very much. I thank you for your part in its presentation." While Purdy and Blom's friendship faltered, other very important friendships flourished. Johann Polak, so the gay patron and founder of the Athenaeum Press, and Purdy began a very intimate friendship and corresponded that lasted until Polak's sudden passing in 1992. Their letters, which can be found in Purdy papers at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, tells a story of great mutual admiration, and which also might explain the sustained interest of Dutch readers in Purdy's novels, and particularly Dutch gay readers. Polak was arguably the most influential literary figure in the Dutch publishing scene in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And this was not just for publishing very important novels, but also for his many affairs with queer artists who then burst onto the scene under his patronage. And so Hans Blom was also one of the lovers of Johann Polak, and that affair then eventually, I think, led to this wide Dutch readership, since Hans Blom introduced Polak to the work of James Purdy. Purdy and Polak shared a very intimate bond in writing. So intimate that whenever Polak had a young new lover who happened to visit New York, he was sure to direct them to James's apartment in Brooklyn. In a letter dated February 7, 1984, he tells James, "One of my dear friends, Leo Gillette, a beautiful boy, plans to come to New York. He is a most charming youth. Maybe you can receive him for a while?" In that same letter, Polak tells Purdy that he's also wired $155 back to Purdy because of a lover of Polak who stayed with Purdy borrowed those 155 euros, and Polak was very ashamed of that. And after reading Michael's biography, we also know that Purdy was a very avaricious person. So the fact that a young and handsome boy could just borrow $155 in the 1980s, if you will, might just raise someone's eyebrow. Well, of course, it's not because of all this gossip, which is also plentiful in Michael's biography, but it wasn't just for all this gossip that Purdy established himself so deeply in Dutch gay literary circles. It was most of all the intimacy and the friendship that Purdy and Polak struck up, but also the intensity of his writing. So the stories that I'm telling here aren't just fun and literary gossip, even though they're also that. They're also ways of illustrating how Purdy in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s already built up these queer international networks that are so important to the gay literary tradition. Queer literati from many European countries connected strongly with his writing and helped Purdy amass an international reputation that was sometimes, or maybe often, greater than his reputation back home. So it is despite of, or rather because of the efforts of people like Polak, that Purdy remains somewhat of a cult figure among Dutch gay readers even to this day. And it's still that the collection of poems that was published in the Netherlands is the only collection of poems published by James Purdy. It was his friendship with tastemakers, the people behind the scenes, like Johan Polak, but also like Gordon Lish, that Purdy's influence is still felt. It is felt in people who can, via figures like Johan Polak, via figures like Gordon Lish, credit James Purdy as a literary influence to themselves. In the Netherlands, there's easily quite a few who, via Johan Polak, trace their literary origin to Purdy. And Purdy's presence remains to this day, because just this summer, a new Dutch translation of I Am Elijah Thrush was published, and there is currently also a Dutch theater company that is staging a play based on Purdy's Narrow Rooms. So in the Netherlands, Purdy will live on, especially among queer Dutch readers. And so I hope that Michael's biography, this beautiful, timely biography, will also establish a great international audience, like Purdy did for himself in the 1970s and 80s in the Netherlands. I thank you.
Do you want to take some questions?
Sure.
Absolutely.
I've got one. You've all alluded to James Purdy's relationship to the generations of queer authors that came before and after him. And I'm curious if there's any contemporary authors that you feel embody his spirit and his approach to like representation in literature. Or if he's one of a kind, never to be...
Shall I take it? The interesting thing about the way in which James Purdy wrote about sexuality in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is that he is making a space for queer narratives, but at the same time already pushing back against the idea that sexual identity is something fixed, something pre-given. So in his literature, he's often trying to create characters that live in this twilight zone between sexual identities and never fully commit to one identity as such. I think there's a lot of queer authors that present similar thinking about identity. Since the 1990s and the early 2000s, we started to think about sexual identity that goes beyond thinking in fixed and constringent categories, right? So in that sense, James Purdy is a prefiguration of all those kind of authors, right? That push against gender stereotypes, sexual stereotypes, and the idea that sexuality should just be cordoned off to one identity.
Awesome, thanks.
Oh, yeah. There's a book called My Dead Book. It's a novel called My Dead Book. I think it's Nate Lippin. Right, I believe the author is Nate Lippin. And that was very much in the spirit of James Purdy. So that was one of my favorites, I think, from last year. My Dead Book. Yeah.
Add to my list, thank you.
Yep.
I wanted to ask, how long did you spend writing this book, and what would you nominate as your biggest challenge?
Well, so I did my my dissertation on James Purdy, and it finished in 2009. So I did some research, biographical research and interviews for it back then. And but I, kind of in between, I did a couple of books on John Joseph Matthews, the Osage writer, but I was still thinking about Purdy and in contact with John Euchre and some kind of the early contacts. So very long process. I sort of estimate about 6 years, for the whole process of the book. But it was kind of stretched out by like 6 years of work on it, for sure. And there are many challenges because there were a lot of gaps and holes in his biography. And he was born in 1914. A while he said it was 1917, but then for a long time it was 1923. So he had 9 years off of his age. And his friend and assistant John Euchre said it corresponded to the years that he was a college professor at Lawrence College, which is now Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. He taught Spanish and freshman studies there. And that it took him so long to establish himself as a writer that they just kind of wanted to cut off that time. And I think he was sending money home to his mother, and he had a lot of obligations at that time. He could finally devote himself to being a writer. But yeah, there were a lot of mystery periods, especially in the 30s, the 40s, that were tough to kind of fill in those gaps. And his college years are slightly nebulous. That's kind of a short chapter, but I did my best. But yeah, there were some places where it's just it was tough to fill in a whole lot of detail. But I mostly did. I was kind of working with the chronology at first to try to fill in these gaps.
Mm, thank you.
You're welcome.
I could ask about like how you would think about the evolution of his theology or his sense of the otherworldly, and maybe related to that, how you would situate him in terms of his relation to Southern Gothic, that I feel like he's comparing to a lot, but he's not quite really situatable with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's that kind of deep. Should I use the mic?
Yeah, you just pull it out.
Yank it out of there.
Okay.
There you go.
There's the kind of the deep Christian background where he kind of described it as Calvinism, kind of Presbyterian background, and so he described reading the Bible, kind of being urged to read the Bible in Sunday school, and even memorizing the whole, Old Testament. So he had these big claims about, memorizing big parts of the Bible growing up, but also Shakespeare, classical literature. There's sort of it is life. They're kind of emerged in doing this book. There's kind of the subliminal religious theme to it, where he's sort of an odd, kind of alternative, perhaps queer, religious writer in some ways, or even Christian writer in some ways. And you have these Christian themes that pop up here and there, especially in Garments the Living, where is the novel where that really emerges quite a bit. But I mean, there are many themes, I think, and his deep compassion for his characters, and he would often speak of that, of not judging his characters. And you can't really. He said you can't. If you're going to write about people, you can't judge them. So that was sort of judgmentalist. He judged sort of a thing. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would say that also the dead are very much, play a very great role in a lot of his novels and plays. That ghosts mean a great deal to James. He said that in the interview with Fred Barron, that his brother came to him. And that ghosts and the dead are significant actors and agents in a lot of his work, so that death and the dead are agents and portals in his novels, so that in a way that desire and living aren't really terminated. I don't know if you would care to continue that line of thinking in some way, but I think that's part of his cosmology.
I love that you quoted Mourners Below in your talk, because Mourners Below by James Purdy is very much one of his underrated works, and it really needs to be reissued. So maybe that will be a reissue in the future. But the plot involves the ghosts of two brothers who died in the war.
And there are many ghosts that continue.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and if we want to talk about Purdy's connection to the otherworldly, to what remains or what is passing, there's a lot of disappearances of characters, of figures, of love in James Purdy.
Right, right.
And James Purdy himself said that all his novels were about love, even though these
Wonderful.
romances were tragic. Still, in most of his tragic novels, Narrow Rooms and In a Shallow Grave and Mourners Below, it is a love that is not accepted by its surroundings,
Exactly.
by small town, Midwestern, Southern United States. So a lot of these tragic novels are situated in the Virginias, in Ohio. And yet at the same time, there's always a compassion in those novels. Purdy was, I think, already trying to voice, or try to lend a voice to a kind of forgotten America, an America where the more liberal lifestyles of New York were not well accepted, and Purdy had lived through that experience growing up in small town Ohio. And he turns towards the spectral, towards the otherworldly, towards religion, to also find redemption for those people that he describes.
That's briefly said.
The novel In a Shallow Grave is particularly resonant, I think, on this issue because there's such a play of kind of the spirit and the flesh and kind of yearning for transcendence, and the Garnet Montrose is kind of disfigured very horribly and almost like turned inside out, and so he's looking for it's about brotherhood and love, and so a lot of kind of spiritual issues or Christian issues that play into that. But he was not a churchgoer after his childhood, but he was, I guess, kind of a Christian in his own bizarre way, or his peculiar way.
He prided himself at being able to quote the Bible by heart.
That's a good question. That's a really big question.
I have a question. Was there anything that, Michael, that you discovered in your research that you thought, oh, I shouldn't put this in because you didn't want to upset any friends of Purdy or any Purdy scholars, or was there something that you put in that you thought, ooh, I could get dinged for, or anything like that?
Well, I had to kind of try to find a balance because these letters where he's just like angry or castigating people. I mean, there's volumes of this, right? I mean, there's a lot more where this came from. The FSG correspondence is very interesting. There's so much of it at the New York Public Library. That was a very interesting archive. But that's kind of a tragic part of the book because he has this really nice arrangement with FSG for R. Strauss Giroux, and then he gets dissatisfied for whatever reason. He wants more money, more recognition, and Doubleday's offering more money, and he jumps over there. But then he's lost this great editor, Robert Giroux, and the first 4 James Purdy books, his first 4 novels, that is Malcolm, The Nephew, Cabaret Begins, Eustace, just some of the works were all edited by Robert Giroux, and he's just such a brilliant editor. So that was a sad part for me, and so I had to kind of cut down some of the ranting and raving.
Yeah, that is so sad.
Some of it's funny though. Just enough is enough sometimes.
Yeah, the excerpt that I read from the letter to Hans Blom, that was, for Purdy standards, perhaps even timid.
I must say, in reading this book, I really had this feeling that I was so glad that I never met James Purdy in life, and that I only buried him.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as I said, that I carried his ashes to Copenhagen and then to Britain, and that I arranged for his funeral 10 years later, but it took 3 years in the planning, and that I never had the opportunity to be hurt by him in life.
Huh.
Because as you go on, it's very juicy gossip. But I think toward the end of the biography, Michael said that one of his friends in later life, Dennis Moore, referred to the term emotionally damaged, and I think that that is a terrible phrase, and that James Purdy as a genius and as a human being can switch on a dime. Is that the phrase? That is the phrase.
Yeah, Dennis Moore said that.
Switch on a dime, and that mercurial genius is so terrifying. And is that the price one pays for the wonderful novels that we have? Who knows?
James knew that he was a brilliant writer, and he knew that he wasn't recognized enough, or he thought that he wasn't recognized enough. And unfortunately, he tended to hold a grudge about his own literary failure, if you will, his not being able to break into a mainstream audience. So what I found very almost disheartening when reading the biography is this anecdote in which, after Cabot Wright Begins is published, Susan Sontag writes a very beautiful review. She says in this review, any publication by James Purdy is a literary event.
Yes.
I mean, this is the highest praise, right? And of course, as you should in a balanced review, Susan Sontag also voices some criticism, but after all, it's still a literary event. But Susan Sontag was also published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Susan Sontag was way more successful than James Purdy, and James Purdy couldn't necessarily stand there. Now, we might suspect here a strand of misogynism, maybe some anti-Semitism, but he really disliked Susan Sontag because she was more successful at the same publisher. And so we read letter after letter after letter after letter where he complains about this one interview or one review by Susan Sontag that he calls condescending. And it's just because, or they published this interview because Farrar wants to push Susan Sontag herself because she's in a relationship with him. Right, so he's pretty nasty in those emails, and that is a shame because he got very stuck on not being recognized enough as an author, and he used that energy to perhaps even sabotage his own career rather than turning that into more and beautiful writing.
But he did use, he would say something like, well, even Susan Sontag said that I was one of the 6 or so writers worth taking seriously on the contemporary scene. Or so, so he could
But then she's also part of the New York establishment.
Right. But he was able to use that good bit, I guess. But yeah, he was very sensitive to she described it as sentimentalism, or maybe she used the word sentimental, and he was very sensitive to that because he didn't want to be seen as a Midwestern sentimentalist or something like that. So. Yeah, that's a very interesting drama, and he got a lot of creative juice out of that. He wrote satires and little anonymous letters, unsaid letters.
Cabot Wright Begins reads as one big satire of the New York publishing scene of the mid-1960s. Some of the caricatures are very, very thinly veiled.
So I wanted to ask, so Elijah Thrush being translated into Dutch is an intriguing proposition because of the language of Elijah Thrush. And which leads me to another issue which was touched upon that I think is worth bringing out, which is Purdy's mastery of dialect, and sometimes dialect you just don't have any idea how he actually would have had human personal contact with it, or enough human personal contact. You're describing this character who you just don't imagine would necessarily be humanly open to the voices of other people, and yet clearly he was, because as he hears it, because he's able to reproduce it. So I wanted to ask that question in general about dialect and Purdy's mastery of the various kinds of American English, but with particular reference to African American English, because, you know, as Michael points out in the biography, and it's kind of a remarkable feature of Purdy that in the age before Google, African Americans often thought that he was an African American because of the way he wrote, which is not a feat that many 20th century white authors in the U.S. have carried off. So I wanted to ask about dialect, Midwest, the various kinds of American English he uses, but I want to make sure we don't pass over the African American
That's
question.
really important.
Well, it's interesting because it goes all the way back to Dame Edith Sitwell, you know, and her discovering him when, you know, he sent his privately published books to her and many other people, and she responded very enthusiastically and got them published in England and then got them published in the U.S. But her biographer and secretary Elizabeth Salter wrote that Edith Sitwell thought she had discovered a great new black writer, you know, on reading it was because of the story Eventide and its use of black dialect. So, and then other people, I guess Langston Hughes to me is the most, you know, kind of notable example of someone who mistook James Purdy for a black writer, you know, because of the use of dialect. And I think even the title "Color of Darkness" he kind of read into that as well, kind of blackness. But yeah, Angus Wilson in England, and you know there were others that had that mistake, and kind of famously Carl Van Vechten. But yeah, I think his use of dialect was probably maybe more convincing to critics and readers early on, probably because he did have more exposure and contact with black people. Joseph Scarrett was a black critic who wrote about that aspect, and he was very inspirational to me, kind of writing about Native Americans in James Purdy's work. But you know, Scarrett was supportive and thought it was, you know, a good psychological portrait, you know, among his black characters. But I think later on he struggled with it a bit, and there were later works that he didn't complete because he was writing black characters, but he didn't feel like he was getting the dialect right. You know, he wasn't sure if he could really do it anymore. I think one of those was called the Manse. There were a couple of different novel projects that weren't finished toward the end. So yeah, I think there is something to that. Like he wrote about people that he knew, and in I'm Elijah Thrush. I mean, we usually talk about Paul Swan as being the model for Elijah himself, but there was John Carlos was a black friend of James's in Chicago, and John Carlos was an artist, and he did some writing himself. And John Carlos was a model for Albert Peggs, who's the narrator. So you know, it's told. I Am Elijah Thrush is remarkable in that way because he was kind of going out on a limb of a white writer, creating this very unconventional black narrator who's kind of stuck in the middle of these two kind of white titans, one who seems to be sort of native too, and kind of this battle of the sexes, right, with Millicent Dufresne and Elijah. So you two probably have things to say about it.
Oh, just one interesting thing about James's dialect that came to the forefront was when, in a translation project, when I tried to introduce James to a Russian audience this last year, was when I took James to St. Petersburg about 12 or 13 weeks before the war, to the Alexandrinsky Theater. They were very interested in Where Quentin Goes. And this was a translation project in which a group of translators were translating 3 American plays, one by a colleague and friend, Walker Trimble, and one by Lauren Yee, a Chinese-American playwright, and one, of course, Where Quentin Goes. And Bill Troop and I were working together on a Russian translation of Where Quentin Goes, and the translation group thought it was going to be easy, because it was just going to be straight James Purdy, American. But Bill Troop said, no, it's not going to be easy, because look at these particular lines. It says, I'm going to buy you a overcoat. Don't don't gloss over that line, don't pass over that line. It's a overcoat. Can you translate that in Russian, please? And then the group that the Purdy translation group just went even whiter than they were, and they just said, "Uh-oh, we've got ourselves a problem," because now Purdy is much more complicated than we thought. How do we translate "a overcoat" into Russian? Because then the dialect becomes something more refined, more countrified. How do you translate the American Midwest into Russian? And then we have the anecdote from Bill Troop that Moe's Villa, last lines of Moe's Villa had to be transcribed rather into a particular way, and no line of it was going to be just kindly edited, because it had to be a particular, have a sensibility about it that was very particular.
If I can add to that untranslatability, perhaps, of Purdy's vernacular into different languages, I don't particularly like to read the Dutch translations. You lose something in the particular dialects that Purdy uses and adopts. And Purdy had always said that he just wrote what he knew, right? So he draws so much of on his direct surroundings, and you read it also in Michael's biography. So many characters can be traced back to people in Purdy's deep family past, especially his novels set in rural Ohio, the series Sleepers in Moonfrown Valleys. And so in these novels, he emulates that Midwestern dialect that feels immediately so strange that they're also placed outside of an America that we might know, because it's already so at the fringes of what we read in literature and how we encounter the American language in literature. So what Purdy is doing there, he's making this space for subjects that are usually not narrated in literature, certainly not in the 1960s and 1970s. And he does something similar, I think, for his black characters. Here too, he refers a lot to his own youth and hearing black women talk on the streets, and he has this anecdote that his mother always sent him out to Ruby, right? Yeah. And he would just sit there at Ruby's kitchen table and talk for an hour and internalize that language. And he then also emulates that language in a story like Eventide, where two black women are in conversation. Here too, he creates a space for a dialect that is definitely not often heard in the 1960s, 70s in American literature. We might ask ourselves, to what extent is this then not literary blackface, right? Emulating these black dialects, and then to what extent could we still do this today, right? I think an author like James Purdy and what he was trying to do in his language would not find as gentle ears. So when in the 1950s and 60s, it was perhaps unremarkable for someone to say, "Oh, you're actually white. I thought you were a black author," based on the dialects in your novels. I think today that would be a more precarious situation, don't you think?
Everything's on the internet, right? Well, right, everybody's picture.
I think that's everything for tonight. So thank you guys so much. That's okay, I don't need my voice. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's have one more round of applause for all of you.